Before we embark on an absolutely breathtaking journey through the history of bread today, and believe me, this will change your perspective on every loaf you've ever eaten, I'd like to ask you a big favor. First, please give us a like, as that really helps us a lot. Second, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, because we're constantly posting content that will challenge your entire understanding of food history. And third, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I'm really curious about our international audience and always love hearing from you. For example, I live in Germany but spend 2 months of the winter in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. Now comes something that will blow your mind. A bread recipe from 1716 that's so simple, so effective, and so delicious that modern baking seems like rocket science in comparison. And the best part? This recipe uses only 4 ingredients. 4. Your supermarket bread, on the other hand, contains more chemicals than a university chemistry lab. Imagine this, it's 1716 and William Salmon publishes the Family Dictionary, essentially the Wikipedia of its time, only actually useful. In this book, you'll find not 1, not 2, but 4 different recipes for something called French bread. Before you think it's some fancy Parisian delicacy, let me correct you, it wasn't called French bread because it was authentically French. It was called that because the English believed anything special had to be French. Typical English logic. But what's truly fascinating about this recipe is this. It represents a type of bread that was considered the epitome of luxury in the 18th century. Yet it's easier to make than the simplest modern bread. Isn't that progress? You might be wondering why this recipe even appears in cookbooks, since most people didn't bake their own bread. Well, the thing is, and this is where it gets really interesting, most common bread recipes aren't found in 18th century cookbooks because people either didn't bake their own bread or the bread was so simple that a recipe was unnecessary. By law, simple peasant bread could only contain 4 ingredients: flour, yeast, water, and salt. Nothing more. The state literally regulated what could be considered bread. But this French bread, that was different. That would be a so-called enriched bread. It contained milk, eggs, sometimes butter, even sugar. It was the luxury version, the bread equivalent of driving a Ferrari instead of walking. And here lies the delightful irony. This luxury bread was actually easier to prepare than regular bread because, and this is crucial, it hardly needs any kneading. The more you knead the dough, the tougher it becomes, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to achieve. Okay, now for the actual recipe, because this is where it gets really interesting. I'm using William Salmon's 1716 version and adapting it because his original recipe was tiny, just 1 liter of flour, which is hardly enough for a decent loaf of bread. Here's what we need. 4 tablespoons ale yeast. I'll explain the modern equivalent in a moment. 1.1 kilo fine flour, a pinch of salt, about a handful. These old recipes were wonderfully imprecise. 4 whole eggs, a pinch of salt, about a handful. These old recipes were wonderfully imprecise. Milk and water, lukewarm, enough to make a very soft dough, a tablespoon of butter. Now let's talk about ale yeast. In Salmon's day, it was sourced from brewers, specifically ale brewers, not beer brewers. The difference? Ale yeast doesn't have the bitter hop aromas of beer yeast, while you can certainly use a good sourdough starter or dry yeast these days. Getting ale yeast from a local brewery is, of course, ideal. Now it gets really exciting because the technique is completely different from modern bread baking. Are you ready? You simply mix everything together and then you stop. That's it. No endless kneading, no gluten developing until you drop. Just mix and you're done. Get yourself a large mixing bowl, and I mean really large, because you need room to work. The dough isn't rolled out and kneaded like with modern bread. It all happens in the bowl. Put the flour in the bowl and sprinkle a handful of salt over it. Don't leave out the salt, otherwise the bread will taste like cardboard and nobody wants that. Now it gets interesting. Heat the milk and water together. The original recipe specifies precise temperatures, lukewarm in summer, slightly warmer in winter. We're aiming for about 35 to 38 degrees C. This is no coincidence. Yeast is sensitive to temperature, and the correct temperature makes all the difference. Crack 4 eggs into a separate bowl, whole eggs, mind you. Forget that modern nonsense about separating the yolks and whites. Melt the butter and let it cool slightly so the eggs don't curdle. Make a well in the flour, basically a depression in the middle, and pour in all the liquid ingredients. Now comes the crucial step. You mix everything only until a very soft dough forms. And by very soft, I mean almost dough-like. This isn't a modern bread dough that you can simply knead. This one is much moister and softer. Here's the crucial point that's been completely forgotten in modern baking: patience. Cover your bowl and let the dough rest for about 15 minutes to an hour by the fireplace, or in a warm spot in your kitchen. The original recipe calls for a quarter of an hour, but the exact time depends on the room temperature and the yeast activity. Instead of kneading and shaping the dough as with modern bread, it is now simply placed in wooden molds. This means you portion the very soft dough into any baking molds you like. The original recipe recommends wooden molds, but you can use whatever you have on hand: loaf pans, round molds, or even individual molds. Then it goes into the oven for an hour and a half at a moderate oven temperature that was common at the time. By today's standards, about 175 to 190 degrees C, 350, 375 degrees feet. And that's what fascinates me so much about this recipe. It defies all the rules of modern bread baking and yet delivers outstanding results. Modern baking is all about gluten development, about kneading the dough until it's so firm that a tennis ball can bounce off it. This recipe, however, does the exact opposite. The high liquid content and minimal kneading result in a bread with an incredibly fine, soft texture. The eggs provide structure and richness. The milk adds flavor and tenderness. And because no rigid gluten network forms, the bread remains soft and tender. This is what bread tasted like before we decided to industrialize and standardize everything. This is how bread should be: simple, delicious, and made from ingredients you can actually pronounce. What truly amazes me is that this exact recipe can be found in cookbooks spanning almost 150 years. I found virtually the same recipe in Robert May's cookbook from 1665, 51 years earlier, and it even appears in The Art of Bread from 1805. That's 140 years for essentially the same recipe. Think about it. This recipe was so good, so reliable, so perfect, that it remained unchanged longer than most countries have existed. Modern bread recipes, on the other hand, change every few years because food scientists discover new ways to add chemicals and preservatives. And here's the really interesting point. This bread was often baked by professional bakers alongside their regular bread. Why? Because the price of regular bread was regulated by the government, while specialty breads like this one were not. This allowed bakers to actually make a profit with these enriched breads, whereas they barely covered their costs with the plain breads. This bread has a texture that industrially produced bread simply cannot achieve. It's soft, but not in that artificial, chemically treated way. It has, as the original recipe states, a very fine texture, almost cake-like yet unmistakably bread. The original recipes often mention scraping or rubbing off the crust when serving. Essentially, you remove the entire crust, leaving only the soft yellow, spongy interior. Of course, I'm not suggesting you throw away the perfectly good crust. It's delicious. But it does show you how soft and delicate this bread was originally meant to be. What fascinates me about this whole thing is that our ancestors, using their seemingly simple methods and few ingredients, ate bread that was nutritionally and in terms of texture far superior to anything you can buy today. They didn't need 30 ingredients or a degree in chemistry to bake a delicious, nutritious, and filling loaf of bread. This bread was baked with stone-ground flour, which preserved all the nutrients. The eggs came from hens that actually saw sunlight. The milk came from grass-fed cows, not those fed industrial feed. Even the salt was probably better, sea salt or rock salt, not the processed salt we use today. Can this recipe be made with modern ingredients today? Of course. Does it taste exactly like the original from 1716? Probably not, because our ingredients have changed. Modern flour is different. It has been bred for different properties, processed differently, and stored differently. But you can still bake something delicious that gives you an idea of what bread used to taste like. Use the best flour you can find, ideally organic and if possible stone-milled. Use fresh eggs from free-range hens whenever possible. Opt for good quality butter, not industrially produced butter. These details are more important than you might think. The real lesson here isn't just the bread itself, it shows how we've complicated things that were once simple. This 350-year-old recipe makes better bread with less effort than most modern recipes. It uses 4 basic ingredients that people have eaten for millennia. It needs no preservatives to stay fresh because it's meant to be eaten fresh. We've somehow convinced ourselves that newer is better, more complex, superior, industrially better than traditional. But sometimes, actually, often, the old methods were better. Not because they were old, but because they worked. So, here's my suggestion. Try this recipe. Honestly, get some good flour, fresh eggs, real butter, and just go for it. Don't overthink it. Don't try to improve it with modern techniques. Just follow the 350-year-old instructions and see what happens. I guarantee you'll be amazed at how easy it is and how good the results are. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wonder why we've made everything so complicated when the simple method has worked perfectly for centuries. You'll find the recipe below in the description, along with suggestions for modern alternatives. Try it out, let me know how you liked it in the comments, and subscribe to our channel, because we have many more culinary adventures from history in store for you. Until next time, your host reminds you that sometimes the best innovations are those that take us back to what has proven successful. The past wasn't primitive, it was simply different, and sometimes different was better. The result? A loaf of bread that would have made your 18th century ancestors proud and put your local bakery to shame. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the linked video to find out why bread in the Middle Ages was much healthier than it is today.